Okay, greetings everyone. This is Robert Rowe for my third critical response and conclusion for the Noah's Flood debate that's been taking place. And let's get started. Since we have now reached the conclusion of this debate, I shall thank my opponents for engaging with me on a topic that is rarely discussed within church. Let me first and foremost highlight the decorum of my opponents as being derived from good Christian candor. This is a quality that far surpasses any particular debate. As Jesus said, "This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So this is going to be my first response to Jen Fishburne, and then I'll respond to Joel, and then I'll conclude. Now, to Jen, again, like before, here are areas of disagreement I have with Jen's second critical response. Quote, Jen writes, "I was going to provide a bit of scientific evidence in this rebuttal, but I decided that historical evidence is not only more apropos, but also less well known in these debates." Well, this is my response. The problem is, Jen, that there is no scientific evidence for a global flood. Any claims about the geographic and hydrogeological scale of Noah's flood should be testable by observation of the natural world. We typically associate floods with swiftly moving turbulent water that rises over riverbanks and returns in a period of hours, days, or weeks. But floods also erode surface material, mostly soil and loose sediment, and deposit them elsewhere. If the Genesis flood covered the entire Earth so that every landform was submerged, shouldn't there be significant evidence of erosion and deposition? Thus, the worldwide scientific community overwhelmingly rejects the geological interpretations of the flood geologists. What would the world drowned by a global flood look like today? Just a quick point on footnote number 2 also. I wanted to emphasize that when I say the worldwide scientific community, most of them also include Christians, good evangelical Christians that are faithful to the scriptures. They acknowledge that there can't be a worldwide or global flood. It's physically impossible. So, if there was a global flood, what would it look like? What would we expect a global flood to deposit billions of dead things buried in the earth? Geologists continue to develop advancing methods on observing different kinds of rock formation and recycling, whether you're talking about igneous rocks crystallizing from magma, sedimentary rocks composed of particles weathered from older rocks, or in the case of limestone, from the accumulation of seashells, and metamorphic rocks that transform from older rocks by heat and pressure. In fact, sedimentary rocks provide a historical record of conditions on the Earth's surface because they contain evidence of ancient life, fossils and tracks, depositional processes, whether you're talking about bedding structures such as ripple marks, mud cracks, raindrop prints, and erosional surfaces, and even past climate conditions, biological, chemical components in the rocks. The thickness of sedimentary rock varies greatly across the continents and in the ocean basins. There are places like the Colorado Plateau where sedimentary rock layers exceed 25,000 feet in thickness. Many of the sandstone and shale layers are composed of sand and clay sediment particles that were eroded from rocks exposed in long disappeared mountain belts. Other layers are composed of limy sediment of shell fragments and mud that accumulated in shallow seas that intermittently cover the continents. The Gulf of Mexico contains over 40,000 feet of sediment that accumulated from sediment shed off from North America, and includes 5,000 feet of salt that could only form from evaporation of large volumes of seawater. So based on this kind of global stratigraphic information, the consensus of mainstream geologists for the past 250 years has been that sedimentary rocks preserve records of deposition over hundreds of millions of years. However, according to Jen's interpretation of the flood in Genesis 7 to 8, we can estimate how fast the water rose to cover something like, say, Mount Ararat, which stands at 16,854 feet above sea level. Over 150 days, water would have to rise. So the 150-day figure is taken from the text, if we're talking about base 10 numbers here. So over 150 days, water would have to rise at an average rate of 112 feet per day and recede over the next 150 days at the same rate. Yet, isn't it curious that Noah lands in his own backyard, not far from where the journey began? So remember in my opening when I argued about the Persian Gulf relative to the Ark's landing on Mount Judy, all within the vicinity of that Arabian Peninsula region, the northeast part where the Armenian Mountains are, and so on. So if it's a global flood, I find it curious that humanity is localized there, a global flood takes place, and Noah lands within 500 kilometers, let's just say, of in that region. That's nothing. Um, Thus, Jen completely ignores but apart from that, Jen completely ignores the physical constraints and mechanical properties of the Earth's crust by presuming the lithospheric plates can move roughly 15 kilometers per day. Instead, plates move at rates of centimeters per year. Instead, geologists find abundant evidence of multiple periods of rising and falling sea level that changed by as much as 400 feet higher or lower than at present. It's the combination of low-standing continental crust and high-standing sea level, followed by uplift, that results in sedimentary layers that now exist above sea level. I touched on this in my opening, relative to the pulse states of how land masses appear over millions of years. Another problem is the thick series of sedimentary rock layers that are folded with bends in the strata by as much as 90 degrees. Because of this, geologists have reported evidence of brittle fracture and slippage along surfaces between layers in these rocks. This kind of deformation can occur in hard rock if high levels of stress are applied to the rock over long periods of time. Thus, there should be no evidence of erosion or exposure to air within sedimentary rock layers if they were deposited in rapid succession beneath the flood water. However, contacts showing evidence for erosion or non-deposition between layers in successions of sedimentary rock, called unconformities, are common on every continent. And so young Earth creationists respond by saying that there is one major unconformity in the Grand Canyon sequence known as the Great Unconformity, claiming that this is the beginning of a global flood deposition. However, there are at least 19 documented unconformities in the 5,000-foot sequence of sedimentary rock in the Grand Canyon. Two such formation contacts feature spectacular buried channels that formed after the underlying units were deposited and their upper surfaces were eroded. Later, the channels were filled with sediment from the overlying formation. Mainstream geologists consider this as evidence as long-term sea level rise and fall across the continents, in this case several times over the past 2 million years, especially during the Ice Age, which again, if you're going to have a rise in sea level, that makes perfect sense with the Persian Gulf flooding that I speak about in my model, the major catastrophic flooding. One of those formations exhibiting erosion on its upper surface is the Red Wall limestone. Along with the channels, we find ancient sinkholes and caves that eventually collapsed and filled with sediment from the overlying formation. Caves form in solid limestone as fresh groundwater dissolves the soluble rock over thousands of years. In fact, A rather serious problem for a global flood involves explaining the abundance and distribution of some of the common types of sedimentary rock. For example, the thick salt deposits in the Gulf of Mexico. So shale is the most abundant sedimentary rock on Earth. More than estimates are more than 50%. Clay minerals that compose shale and other mud rocks are derived from the chemical weathering of minerals, including feldspar and mica, that are abundant in older igneous rocks. For example, when you contrast it to the mineral quartz, which is the predominant mineral in sandstone and siltstone, it's not altered during chemical weathering. Clay accumulates in the soil cover over bedrock. Soil erosion removes the clay by wind and water transport to lakes or to the sea, where clay settles out of suspension in calm water conditions. So, in a nutshell, turbulence keeps the clay in suspension. All the clay in the most abundant rock in the Earth's crust had to be created through soil formation before it could be deposited. All the soil on Earth at any given moment in its history could not provide enough clay for all these rocks. The turbulence of the rising and falling floodwaters would keep clay particles in permanent suspension. So that's an irony of this. Limestone is composed of whole shells, broken shells, and limy mud. The shells in limestone have not been transported far from where the animals and calcareous algae lived on the sea floor. Most of the types of ancient limestone can be compared to deposits on modern coastlines, like on the Persian Gulf, the Bahamas Platform, Florida Bay, and the Great Barrier Reef. They form in shallow water below the tides and on intertidal mudflats. All the seashell animals on Earth at any given moment in its history could not provide enough limy sediment for the total thickness of limestone around the world. Limy sediment could not have been derived from the erosion of older limestone rocks by advancing floodwater either. As mentioned above about the caves and sinkholes, because limestone is soft and soluble, weathering limestone does not produce much sediment. For example, the devastating tsunamis that ravaged the Indian Ocean and Japan in 2011. 20 is it? Yeah. Anyway, it's about roughly 5-6 years ago. Gives us clues about rapidly rising water across large distances. So devastating tsunamis that ravaged the Indian Ocean and Japan give us clues about rapidly rising water across large distances. Tsunami waves as high as 30 meters above normal seawater, advancing several kilometers on land with speeds of roughly 30 kilometers per hour, can easily destroy human structures. However, here's another irony. Geologists have discovered that tsunami sediment deposits are generally less than 25 centimeters thick and conform to the antecedent landscape. That is, there's actually no significant change in topography. Large coastal storms also surge water on the land of the coast, but storm deposits are only slightly thicker and confined to the beach and near shore. Now again, to flood the earth to the highest mountains in 150 days would require water to rise just 112 feet per day and fall at about the same rate. And here's the ultimate irony. While this sounds like a dramatic rise, not all that much sediment would be produced or move very far away. Most of the geological work of erosion would occur at the water-land interface, which in this case is the rising shoreline. But just as with a surging tsunami, there is not much time to excavate large quantities of sediment. At roughly 15 kilometers per hour for a typical tsunami, which is 126,720 feet per day, so that's fast. This is 1,130 times faster than the rate of the global flood. Because remember, the global flood, if you stretch it out 150 days, You're talking 112 feet per day, not 126,000 feet per day, as with a typical tsunami. So it's a very slow rise. So thus, it's too slow to move even grains of sand. So that's another paradox. Let's say, let's just put it this. What I'm doing is I'm laying out all these paradoxes that highlight the physical improbability, in fact, the impossibility of having a global flood. Um, and just to point out the math behind that, so if 112 feet per day is roughly 0.04 centimeters per second, you need velocity of 10 to 100 centimeters per second to move sand particles, because the sand size ranges between 1/16th of a millimeter to roughly 2 millimeters in, 1/16th millimeters in diameter and 2 millimeters in diameter. So 112 feet per day is 0.04 centimeters per second. That is vastly smaller than 10 to 100 centimeters per second. Um, the impact of rising floodwater over the Earth's surface can be illustrated on a hypsometric curve, a graph showing the land surface and ocean floor at different elevations and depths. I don't think I have much time to go through this, but it's there for you guys to, because I explain it in the next part. So just so all you need to know is the y-axis here is elevation, the x-axis is the percentage of Earth's surface, and obviously here on the other side of the y-axis you have the depth. So here's your sea level, and here's where you have continents rising above sea level and anything below that, and so on. This is a classic curve that's used in all geology textbooks. As the floodwater begins to rise above sea level, it would cross lower elevations that represent 20% of Earth's total surface area. Despite the large surface area, the lower elevation would not provide much erosional potential. And so with 112 feet per day water rise, 112 feet per day water rise, erosion would be limited to surface material with hard bedrock left largely untouched. Only 10% of the Earth's total surface area lies above the average land elevation. And so the upland surface area would produce less sediment, but certainly there is more erosional potential with steeper slopes. Thus, nothing like the tens of thousands of feet of sediment and sedimentary rock found in different places around the globe would be generated during a one-year global flood. And that's my that's my response to Jen. I think that just completely blows it out of the water, to be honest. Um, okay, now with my response to Joel Anderson. So Joel actually, I'm pretty sure in my second rebuttal, I spoke about either my first rebuttal or my second rebuttal. I spoke about. Actually, no, it was in my second rebuttal. I responded to Joel and spoke about a sensus planoa. Um, about reading modern science into Genesis, but at the same time acknowledging the ancient Near Eastern motifs. So I'm specifically going to respond specifically to that. So quote, if Robert agrees with my take on the genre of Genesis 1 to 11 being that of myth, I'm not understanding his claim that Genesis 6 to 9 is essentially a historical documentary of a real man named Noah and a local Mesopotamian flood. Okay, so I this is going to be my response. Joel, as you argued yourself, myth is concerned with ultimate realities, not fiction. Even though preserved in the forms of stories or epic poems, myths are not fantasy. Myth is a type of literature that does not necessarily look like historiography. It could be written in poetic form and may employ highly symbolic language, and yet myth can be considered writing about real events. Thus, biblical authors used mythological motifs even when writing about historical events and known individuals. For example, Ezekiel likens Pharaoh Hopra to, quote, a monster at sea. Here, the biblical term Tanin references the chaos sea monster known from Ugaritic literature. It is this same monster that was mastered and defeated by Yahweh. Thus, Ezekiel saw no conflict in appropriating a mythological motif in service to a contemporary historical event, just as the Noah of Mesopotamia, which would be Utnapishtim, is identified as originating from the Sumerian city of Shuruppak and the son of Ubatutu, which is the last king of Shuruppak before the flood. And this is according to the Sumerian king list. Why? Because Shuruppak has been identified with the site of Farah south of Baghdad, where the earliest remains go back to the late 4th millennium BC. Furthermore, Gilgamesh is believed to have been the historic king of Uruk around 2750 BC, even though the Gilgamesh epic with its flood story has mythic elements and deals with legendary heroes set in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Now, again, this baffles my mind when actual geographical areas are given that this is just conveniently ignored, especially in my opening where I specifically highlight the science as relating to what the ancient Near Eastern texts were getting at, and that is the geographical locale that's within these ancient Near Eastern texts, including Genesis 6 to 9. So, thus, this is the mountainous region north of ancient Assyria that extends into the Caucasus Mountains. Caucasus, sorry. Thus, the ark lands in a geographically recognizable area in North uh, Mesopotamia. In fact, look at Genesis 10, how it names the sons of Noah and the places they settled and the cities they founded. While these are scattered across the ancient Near East, the Levant, Anatolia, and North Africa, the names of Babel, Uruk, uh, and Kalna in the land of Shinar, so this is Genesis 10, chapter 10, verse 10, show the centrality of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley in the post-flood tradition. Given the Mesopotamian origins of Abraham, it shouldn't surprise us that the flood story derives from an ancient, real, historical memory delivered to the Israelites and their ancient Near Eastern counterparts. Now, if Joel's an evangelical, and I believe he's a solid Christian. He's yeah, I consider him an excellent scholar. But his ridicule of my concordist perspective, um, here's my final point to Joel, which he needs to take seriously. It's counterintuitive to think that exilic, monotheistic Jewish writers borrowed fictive pagan stories to establish their cosmology and prehistory, and then somehow magically transform them to fit the theological truths of Jesus. I just want that to be kept in mind. And specifically, where in the New Testament do we see this? 1 Peter 3, verses 18 to 22. Why is that passage significant? Not only does Peter mention the crucifixion and resurrection, he speaks about the spirits in prison, and he uses the flood as a baptism typology. That is just rich with ancient Near Eastern parallels because you have the Apkallu tradition that's associated in the spirits in prison, the whole Watcher context, which Jen has been trying to appeal to, but um, to be honest, that really isn't the context of this discussion. But basically, 1 Peter 3 verses 18 to 22. If you believe that's true, and let's go a little bit further, if you believe that this is inspired by the Holy Spirit, that here's a canon of Scripture that is theopneustos, God-breathed, you're telling me that God is going along with the fictive pagan history which has no history, and then applying it to Jesus as supposedly being true. So if that stuff never happened, then Jesus going and speaking to the Watchers during his death for those 3 days, they don't exist. So where did Jesus go? Did he just, was he in limbo, in like a void? So this is a very specific thing you have to keep in mind. And so that being said, I'm going to conclude with a complete summary of my um, flood model, just to summarize my opening, because I think again, none of this has been throughout the debate, none of this has been actually engaged or debunked in any way. So yeah, I'm going to read out my conclusion here. So to reiterate my flood model that encompasses an empirical scientific evaluation in light of the textual clues from Genesis 1 to 11, allow me to summarize. I believe the geographical extent of Noah's flood occurred within the Persian Gulf, a region that was occupied by early humans during the late Pleistocene between 70,000 years ago and 13,000 years ago. In this case, which would be the end of the last ice age, and hence the advent of the Holocene period. We need to note that Genesis 1 details for us chronologically the natural history of Earth. So I'm not saying that Genesis 1 is only a concordist modern scientific text. I'm readily acknowledging that Genesis 1 could be read as a cosmic temple text of the ancient Near East and so on, but it does fit the profile. Like if you read it chronologically, it gives pretty much an accurate account of natural history. Our current geological research has developed an extremely detailed tectonic profile showcasing relatively fixed shorelines, where the oceans will never again cover the entire Earth, as was initially the case in the early stages of the planet's formation 3.8 billion years ago. Evidence for this is via osmium isotope analysis, where land masses occur in pulsed states, affirming that the Earth will never undergo a global flood. And all of this is also in accordance with Psalm 104, verse 6 to 9, which is a creation psalm. A 2007 paper highlighted this fact, and also a 2009 paper showed evidence that the Earth first had a roughly 1 kilometer deep global ocean during the late heavy bombardment period, basically, 3.8 billion years ago. I then researched migration patterns of humans because in what location are the events of Genesis 6 to 9? If Noah's flood was global, then that would not account for the fact that we already have established in Genesis 2 a specific location for these particular humans located in the Persian Gulf. There's evidence for their existence as far back as roughly 70,000 years. I conclude that Genesis 1 is speaking of pre-Adamic humans that multiply into a large enough population to fill the earth, as Genesis 1 says. These humans migrate northeast out of Africa, and as seen in Genesis 2, they arrive into the Arabian Peninsula, where specific geographical markers are given with the mention of 4 rivers. Using anthropological and archaeological studies as well as geological data to pinpoint the rivers Pishon and Gihon, because we know where the Tigris and Euphrates are. I locate Eden at the head of the once dry Persian Gulf, and so a 2010 paper highlights this information, the Jeffrey Rose paper. Therefore, Noah and the flood would have occurred roughly 13,000 years ago, near the end of the Holocene in this region, and this is most important because this is highlighted in a 2015 paper showing evidence that it was a sudden flooding within a very short time, pretty much roughly the same time frame, like within a year, as the Genesis account illustrates. And it's extensive. It never happens again. That's the point. Because I believe Joel likes to say that there are many floods in Mesopotamia that the text could be borrowing from. No, this is a specific flood that was quite extensive at that time. After finally establishing the backdrop in regards to all these details from Genesis 1 to 3 in light of scientific research, it makes sense then to now develop a clearer picture of what's happening in Genesis 6 to 8, which comes from a 1971 paper on, quote, the mountains of El, where based on ancient Near Eastern data and the details given in Genesis 6 1 to 4, the Watcher Apkallu tradition, In the context of the Nephilim, we can pinpoint where the ark landed, thus again affirming the size of the flood. So from the Persian Gulf, if the ark goes a certain distance north, that is your relative size. The ark didn't go this way, the ark didn't go that way, the ark didn't go down there. It moved just there, which means that makes sense because if the waters are rising and flowing in this direction, moving inland, a boat's going to move that direction and then halt as the waters are receding. Um, so thus again affirming the size of the flood around the region of Mount Judy, much further south from Ararat. So obviously the floodwaters didn't cover Ararat because if it did, then you need a global flood. Um, and hence much closer to that Edenic geography as established in the earlier points. With respect to the species that experienced this flood 13,000 years ago, a 2016 paper highlights a direct proportion with the list of species mentioned in Genesis and Job that would have interacted with Noah. Thus, no inclusion of polar bears, emperor penguins, or dinosaurs. And the species that would have been on the ark, or would have been have an interaction with Noah, would have been the lion, raven, goat, deer, donkey, wild ox, ostrich, horse, hawk, and eagle. All right. Thank you for listening to my third critical response and conclusion. God bless, and I hope that. And I also want to thank David, the organizer, for this debate. This has been fun and, educational to see how people interact. And yeah, I hope that all of this is used for God's glory ultimately.